So I'm really excited to do this Network Perspectives panel. And so let me introduce to you a little bit about the background of what's going to happen there. It's important for us to have you hear from other members of the network, teachers, local improvement facilitators in particular during this panel. They're going to get a chance to tell their stories. And we know that the power of stories and how it brings us all together, we can find like-mindedness, we can hear challenges, we can really gain from others some great takeaways. We've also brought this panel to you because we've heard you say to us how important it is to hear from one another and what's going on. You're in 3 different school districts, you're in 13 different campuses. So this is an opportunity to hear about actions that were taken at various campuses, to hear their successes, to hear lessons learned over this past year, and how what folks have learned and tried and adapted or adopted or abandoned, how that is influencing the continuation of their improvement work. In particular, how they're able to consider and make changes in order to see more equitable outcomes for their students. It's great that we get to highlight the learning that various teachers and instructional coaches have been having, even in this year that has been so different from what we could ever have expected. And we want you to hear from others in the field what happens when students are showing up as their most empowered selves. And one last thing is this also allows us to share with you through your colleagues different kinds of sources of data that are used in improvement work, especially student voice. So I'm really excited to bring some panelists from each of the school districts here. As they're sharing, I want you to listen for how they were positioned as learners themselves and their commitment to learning and how that influenced their teaching and their leadership practices and how that helped them to really make changes for students. I want you to listen for how student voice provided rich data and insight into the practices of these educators. And I also want you to pay attention to how these education leaders describe their own mindset and the actions that they have taken in order to intentionally disrupt inequities, particularly those in instruction or maybe even in the learning environment itself. So with that, let me bring on board our 4 panelists from across our network. I want to introduce to you from Duncanville ISD, Ms. Latrina Bowen and Coach Demore Spotzer. And I'm really excited that they're going to be here with us to share about their experience this year. We also have Karen Landum from West Junior High and Richardson ISD. And also our 4th panelist is from Crowley ISD, and that is CJ Hill. So we'll see each one of these colleagues added to the spotlight here with me in just a moment. And we have a series of 4 questions that they have known in advance, and we're going to be having them respond to those questions. So while we're getting Ms. Bowen, Coach Spotzer, Ms. Landum, and Mr. Hill added to the spotlight, and I'll ask each one of them to unmute themselves as their turn comes to speak. I just would like for you all to use your reaction button and give them some sort of a celebration, right? Want them to just say thank you for their willingness to share their story. So I see Ms. Bowen in the spotlight. I'm waiting to see if we can get the other folks added into the spotlight. Are we able to do that?
Everyone's being added. Just be patient for a second.
Okay, thanks. Well, Ms. Bowen, you know what? Since you're here on Spotlight with me, how about if I ask you the first question? Are you good with that? All right. I see that.
Yes, I am.
I see that smile in your eyes, so that makes it exciting. So the first question that we asked you to think about was for you to share with us about your change idea and how your PDSA cycle progressed through the year. And after you speak, then I'll ask CJ, Demore, and Karen to share as well. So tell us about your change idea and your PDSA cycle this year.
Okay, well, on our campus, we have our 7th and 8th grade team. Our 7th grade team, which is the team that I'm on, beginning of the year, we did whiteboards and seeing if that made a difference in how students show their thinking. We was just trying to come up with different ways of students to show their thinking with social distancing and making sure that we can, without being in proximity of one another, how we can see students' growth in understanding and knowledge of their work.
Great, thank you.
Um, and then we also kind of progressed on into our virtual students, how EdPuzzle work with our virtual students, and if they actually understood based off of what our 7th and 8th grade team both did those change ideas with EdPuzzle, and seeing if the students actually understood based off our content that we were teaching our students, to see if they actually understood in group.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing how you were doing that work in both 7th grade and 8th grade. So same question, CJ, and then DeMaurier, and finally, Karen, what was your change idea and how did your PDSA cycles progress throughout this past year?
So our change idea started kind of in the philosophical realm with this idea of the achievement gap and what really causes the achievement gap, or what we perceive to cause the achievement gap. And we propose the idea that the achievement gap is caused by an expectation gap, that we have different expectations for different students and that those compound over the years. So you get to 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and if you've had lower expectations for 6, 7, and 8 years of your academic experience, you are going to perform lower, and then your teachers will have different expectations for you. So then we started thinking, okay, but what can we do about that in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade? How do we change that expectation gap? And so we started thinking of our own teaching practices, and maybe some ways where we had different expectations and didn't even realize it. And the example that we came up with was, you're in a classroom, you're giving a lesson, and you want to poll how your students are doing. So you ask the question, you give a little bit of wait time, and some hands shoot up in your class, and you pick Susan sitting in the front, and Susan answers. And so Susan had a great learning experience there. She was engaged in the lesson. She was able to show you that she understood. But the other 20-something odd kids in the class were all able to opt out. At that moment, they had to do nothing in the learning. And oftentimes we have, say, the quiet student, they're not a disruption, so they're not being called on, who just sits at the back of the class and doesn't have that enrichment. Well, how do we reach that student? So we started with the idea that we needed to elicit student thinking from all students, not just one or two. So that meant volunteerism had to be completely removed from the classroom. So then the next step after that is cold calling. So you give, some wait time, and you call on a few students. Well, now everyone has to think about whatever is happening, and you can poll to see their thought processes, but you're still only polling, say, a few students. And that was actually our very first change idea, or our very first step in the PDSA cycle, was to remove volunteerism and move to that cold calling with wait time. But then we realized we still have a problem, because that's not all students. So then it was, we need to look at what are other ways to elicit student thinking. So that was shifting to whiteboards, Pear Deck, especially in a virtual year, and really getting into the nitty gritty of every single student's response. And then we ended up the year, or rounded out the year, with this idea that, okay, once we have where we're engaging all students, how do we engage all students at a quality level? And so we wanted to shift that engagement from compliant to authentic. And so we added in another layer of student discourse. So if we can have students interacting with each other about the content, their engagement is going to be more authentic, their learning is going to be more authentic. And so that's kind of where we ended the year.
Right. Thank you, CJ. I hear real progression, right, of improvement in what you shared there. And Latrina, I so appreciate, I can see your head nodding, and I saw Coach Spotzer, I saw you nodding, and Karen as well, recognizing, right, the cycle of improvement that was going on there. Coach, how about you? What was going on at Reed Middle School this year?
So this year our change was to students will answer questions, reflect on their participation in class discussion. So we dealt with a lot of online versus in-class students. At the beginning of the school year, we were strictly virtual. And as math teachers, it was hard for us to just get our kids to participate on the online discussions. We would sit there, ask questions, and you'll just keep sitting there waiting for an answer. So as a team, we came up with, let's see why our students are doing this and why aren't they participating, or why are they just so quiet? Are they at the computer, or are they even trying to learn? So when it came down to it, we created surveys to figure out what our students are doing at home, if they're participating, or if they're just scared to speak up. And so when it came down to it, we figured out they were very honest with us at the last minute. And I was surprised, we were surprised. So throughout the year, we kept testing them and surveying them on their participation. Do they think they're participating enough? Why are they not participating? And we kept doing it with the virtual and the in-class students as they progressed the students to come in. And then even later on, keep throughout the year, we had more in-class students versus the virtual. And we kept testing both of those throughout the year to see what's going on with you. And I guess we'll get to the rest of the survey answers after that. I don't want to go too far ahead, but that's what we tested. We tested participation in the classroom and just see if is it something that as teachers that we can do to make the students feel better about themselves, or why. So that's what we tested this year.
Good. And I like how you're going to keep our audience kind of hanging on the edge of your seat and not giving away all the juicy details here in the beginning.
Yes,
thank you for sharing about how you incorporated student voice in that way. Karen, what about you at Richardson at West?
Well, one thing that we noticed is when kids come to us, a lot of times they are really behind and they never know where to start a problem. And since they don't know where to start, they just immediately give up. They just throw up their hands and say, I can't do this, and they won't try. And so we wanted to intentionally introduce anchor charts so that they had a place to go to get help on their own. So we started off our cycle by introducing the anchor charts and making sure that the kids we had in person and the kids that we had virtually all had equal access to the anchor charts. And then we looked at their scores from QSA to QSA. And then as the year progressed and we saw that they actually were being effective, then we wanted to see what happens if we more intentionally teach how to use the anchor charts and really modeling using them every single time you do a problem with, in every concept that we had an anchor chart for, to see if they would more embrace them and really, take them on as, part of their regular learning, that they would use them without being prompted, with the ultimate goal next year of having them more create their own.
Okay. Great. Thank you for that. And Karen, I'm going to stay here with you. So knowing that you and the team at Richardson West were focused on these anchor charts, what did you and the team have to do in terms of your own learning, right, in order to, try to bring about, the change and the improvement? And in that process of learning, was there anything that surprised you as learners?
Well, first of all, we had to figure out how the heck to do them virtually, because we'd already had, a lot of us had them, on chart paper on the wall, and trying to figure out how to get that in a digital format that would work for everyone and that was easy to access, but wasn't impossible for us to keep up with. That was a big learning curve at the beginning, and we had some false starts, but eventually settled on something we really liked. And then the thing that surprised us was when we first went into our first round of data, we thought that it would probably be like the mid-level to higher kids that would most benefit from them, or there we see the most improvement in scores, because they were the ones that were using them more, and they could access the information better because they already had some prior knowledge. But as it turned out, the lower level kids actually did benefit quite a bit from them. They showed a great deal of growth in our first round.
Great, thank you. And you said you had some false starts, and I'm going to challenge you to reframe that as you had some rapid fails from which you learned, right, and were able to make some adaptations. Yeah, good. Well, Latrina, how about you? Talk about learning, whether it was for you or among your team, right? In order to implement the improvements that you were seeking. What did you have to learn, and what might have surprised you in that process?
For us, utilizing EdPuzzle, we really struggle with making sure that are the kids really gaining a understanding, or are they what are they understanding about time before they end the lesson, and are they can they apply that independently? So some of the struggles that we had were video creation and design, and how we wanted it actually laid out and structured. Those open-ended type of questions we want to really incorporate inside of the puzzle. Just coming up with the different types of questions, and how we actually wanted the students to note take, and making sure they had that piece written down so they can always refer back to.
Yeah, great. And let me just ask either CJ or Coach, do either one of you want to talk about learning?
Yeah, I learned that even though they're kids and the virtual aspect, they were quite honest with us this year on how this school year affected on them. I also learned that as a teacher, or educator, I should say, doing virtual was not as easy as we thought, or as I thought it was going to be. So creating fun atmospheres and just things that the students would want to be engaged with was tougher than I thought. And so this year, I know TxNSI, they helped us out a lot to find new outlets to let our students just be interactive and try to get that usual, somewhat unusual feel of being at school while they're at home. So that's some things I learned. I'm just trying to be more creative for our students that are at home. And it was tougher than I thought it was going to be.
Go ahead, CJ.
I was just going to say one thing that we learned on our campus that really surprised us. We had this change idea of eliciting all students' thinking using whiteboards and Pear Deck, and we started to improve. And we thought we were kind of following the right track. Everything was moving in the right direction. But the closer we got to testing season, the more these best practices that we knew worked kind of faded out of our classrooms, where the stress of testing and the stress of kind of the weight of this test, even with accountability not counting this year, that we've got to prepare them, we've got to do more practice. We found that these practices kind of waned, and we didn't expect that. We just expected that, we didn't expect to peak, I guess you could say, around Christmas time. We expected that trajectory to move up the remainder of the year. But in fact, we peaked and we actually kind of plateaued and then fell a bit towards the end of the year as we got closer and closer to, again, STAR test, which just kind of gives us some insight into next year and things that we need to overcome that, we just had no idea. It just wasn't something. You don't think about putting aside best practices right before something that is high stakes. You would think it'd be the opposite. You would want to keep those best practices when there's something high stakes.
So that's an interesting reflection there. And so I'm going to put you guys a little bit on the spot on this one based on what CJ just shared there. And this will be our last question before I see if there might be some questions from others in the group, from your colleagues that are stirring in their mind. So knowing that in testing season, right, you potentially pulled back on the improvement practices, right, that you were working on, what is that causing you to consider as you think about next year?
I can specifically say that number one, being aware of it is kind of that first step. Like if you don't even know there's a problem, then you don't know to even be proactive and fix it. So that leads to our PLC conversations. So now when we're in PLC, we say, okay, remember last year, this was the time when we stopped eliciting student thinking, when we stopped having student discourse. So how are we being intentional about incorporating that now when it matters most, versus just trying to get as much practice in as possible. So I think it's the knowledge of it is almost the cure in a sense. We already know the right thing to know, the right thing to do. We already know kind of the best practices and the right steps. It's a matter of that consistency, at least for us on our campus, and almost the accountability that the PDSA cycle and the data that we collected gave us. It kind of added accountability to what we were doing in the classroom.
Thank you. Who else wants to respond to that about, yeah, Latrina?
I agree with CJ. Consistency was definitely one of those things that needed to happen from beginning to end, because our change ideas kind of like fell through. And then, like you said, we went into those, all right, start time. Now that that best practices fell through. So I definitely agree, consistency. So next year going in, we have a better idea, like what worked really well and how to improve on those things that worked really well and incorporate it into start testing time.
Great.
For us, we were talking about like going into testing that, like our anchor charts are designed, we didn't ease up on them all year long, but what we want to try to do next year is figure out how to release so that they have the anchor chart and then they're slowly releasing to create their own, so that when we get to testing, instead of always looking at our anchor charts, they're able to create their own, basically do like a brain dump, a structured brain dump, so that they still have that knowledge, but we've released them so that they can, take ownership of it when they really need it.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen.
Yes, and we did, like she said, with the brain dump, we did brain dumping, but I feel like sometimes we could start earlier and use it more of a whole school year thing, especially when it comes to STAR testing, because the stresses of STAR testing on these, it's bigger on the kids than we expect, and then we think about. And so if the consistency part of it throughout the entire year, all the way through the testing part, it'll definitely keep them on the right track, because our students work off consistency. And once that consistency starts breaking, then, they can start going straight down here on their own mindset. So the longer we keep it going, the longer and the earlier we start it, I think it'll be great for our students as a whole.
Yeah, awesome. We didn't get through all the questions that we had, but you all touched on several of the points about the different kinds of data that you were using. I heard you talk about student data and student voice. I heard you talk about, looking at your assessments that you have locally that, gave you information, and obviously the information that you had from your improvement cycles that you collected. And thank you as well for sharing things that you were learning along the way. We're going to invite our colleagues to actually take some time to reflect on the things that they have heard and go into breakout rooms for just about 10 minutes or so. And so you see the questions there on the slide. Thank you, Erin, for sharing those. And we really just want you to be thoughtful with one another. And the questions are also going to go into the chat, and really begin to reflect on, what did you hear that was interesting, right? And what did you hear that was surprising? What, in terms of what was shared, created some cognitive dissonance for you? Like, what challenged your own thinking about your work as an improver? And then finally, talk together with your partners. You'll be in a room with, maybe up to a total of 4 people at most. But talk about how you're going to use what you learned from the panel as you think about being an improver, as we consider where we're headed for the next year. So we're going to drop those questions into the chat so that you have them as you go into your breakout rooms. Like, you'll either be in a trio or a quad, and we will be in there for a total of about 12 minutes. So we'll see everybody back here at 4:32. Great. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to spotlight our panelists again. As soon as they get back in the room from the conversation. Great. We're almost all back. All right, I see Karen is spotlit. And there's Coach. We'll get Coach Spotzer and Latrina back on spotlight, and CJ as well, as soon as he gets back in the room. Wonderful. So we have a few minutes to just kind of debrief this conversation together. And so we're going to just stay like we are. Like I said, our speakers are spotlit, our panelists are spotlit for us. And I'm really interested to hear from others, and feel free to raise your hand and we'll get you called on. What are some things that you learned from the panelists that you are thinking about applying in your own practice? Would love to hear from some others. What did you learn? What did you learn from these panelists? You can also share some appreciations that you might have for them and things that they specifically said that brought new learning for you. I know there was some applause given in the chat. Now, don't be shy. Just,
I'll go ahead and add in.
Thank you.
I got kids, so if you hear,
yeah, we can hear you,
all the
Darren.
screaming and all that good stuff. But one of the things that I kind of saw in the chat was a rapid failing or whatnot, and then the kind of concern that when STAR testing came around, how we fall back into like that routine, like, oh, we left the best practice and all that stuff alone and whatnot. And so what it made me think of is next year pushing my students to fail more early, because I at least know when they start to fail, they're getting closer to that solution, or that, you know, getting it correct or whatnot. So it just made me kind of switch the way I was thinking. I probably tend more so to only want them to fail once, because then I can quickly, oh, they got it. But I think it's also with that rapid failing that they also are seeing their own progress towards the, you know, correct answer or whatnot.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. And so as you model that as the adult learner in the room, right, then you can also bring that about with your students and let them know that, you know, just make that mistake, you know, and let's learn from it and let's pick up and keep going. Thank you for celebrating that. Yeah, Billy, go ahead. I see your hand.
Okay, this isn't like a celebration, but it's more of a like, kind of like a, if that makes sense, that hearing another district say that the hybrid learning and the online like virtual learning was a huge challenge for them that they had to overcome, and not necessarily overcome, but it was a huge challenge that they had to face. And that it was one of the, you know, bigger challenges of this year, because I know that it was a huge challenge that my teachers faced, and that, you know, and it's still a big challenge because, I mean, that was just one brutal thing that we faced this year. And so just to hear another district also faced it. So like, it's not just us, you know, and so that was one thing that I took away from this.
Yep, exactly. You know, we see it in the news, right, that it's happening everywhere. But when someone else voices over similar sentiments, right, and experiences, you get a bit of release. Kayla, I'm going to come to you in a second. Patience, I want to lift up something that you put in the chat. You were appreciating the accountability and appreciate you saying that we, as I think you mean teachers and educators, are eager to fix the scholars, right, in our buildings. But this was a good opportunity to, you know, fix ourselves using your own language and get back to the practices that are the ones that you know you need to use. So I can't see your face, Patience, because of the many people in the room, but I appreciate you for putting that in the chat. Kayla.
I appreciate the group that talked about talking to students and, you know, kind of doing those interviews as to getting their true feedback from how the year went and what went well and what didn't go well. I have starred as I've looked at scores and kids who have, you know, drastically dropped from 19 to 21 as far as progress measures go, like starred them. And I'm going to attempt some empathy interviews before we're done, just to figure out, what went well for you 2 years ago that didn't go well for you this year? Where did you struggle? To see if I thought when I was looking at this, there was going to be a big discrepancy between virtual and in-person students, and that's not what I found. So I think, asking those questions further, and I appreciate that reminder from the other group about how important it is to seek feedback from students about, we might be learning a lot, we might be making assumptions about what happened and what didn't happen for them this year, and actually asking them, they're middle schoolers, they can give you a really good perspective to try to answer some questions going into next year. So I'm hopeful. That was one of the biggest things I've taken away from TxNSI, was the part on empathy interviews and how to do those. So I'm going to attempt those this year. And I just was going to say, I appreciate the group bringing those up as a reminder how important it was.
Yeah, and I know some of you may want to just quickly drop in the chat from various campuses if you actually conducted empathy interviews with students. I know that there were campuses in Richardson that did that. I know there were campuses in Duncanville that did that as well. So that way, Kayla, you might get some names of folks that you can directly tap into who have been through the process and can give you some pointers and tips on that. Thank you for raising that up. We've got just a couple of minutes left. What else did you learn? Are you still chewing on? Do you want to express appreciation for, or is there a question that you have maybe specifically for one of the panelists?
I have a question for the panelists. I know that we all, same initiative, but we all, every campus, this probably looks different. I think it was the Richardson West campus that stood out because I love West. My daughter went there, but how did you connect those anchor charts to this vocabulary? Because I know traditionally we use our anchor charts for strategies and, a quick reference guide. How did you connect that to your vocabulary, your anchor charts to your vocabulary?
Like to the math vocabulary? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, because I'm sixth grade, so mine look like I see addition, I do subtraction, so there's not a whole lot of vocabulary, but I feel like there should be.
Ours, we tried to design ours with as many pictures as possible. We'd have, sometimes just an example problem. Sometimes it would be steps written out. Sometimes it would be just vocabulary. It depended on the different topic. And especially in the second semester, we really tried, it especially hit hard in when we did geometry. We tried to, as we're presenting the lesson, I'm like, okay, what kind of problem is this? Oh, I think this is a volume problem. Where do I go to figure out how to do a volume problem? Pull up the anchor chart and have them start to work and just try to get them in the habit of doing it. But how they were designed, they were all different ways. We're going to try to design them this coming year, I think, is where we're going. Try to design them with, more pictures and more things that are where we can scaffold it, where we can start pulling away some of the content and having them start to fill in more of it on their own so that they're filling in. And even possibly, we were talking about earlier today, possibly having an area where they can put onto the anchor chart things that's their content alone. I need to know this, and put it on there.
Thank you.
Great. All right, we are in our final 30 seconds. And what I would like for you guys to do is we'll do one more waterfall chat. Want you to put some sort of a celebration word, term, phrase into the chat. And this is going to be the way that we are going to give our applause to all of our panelists. Again, thank you, Karen Landon from Richardson West. Thank you, Latrina Bowen from Byrd Middle School in Duncanville. Thank you, Coach Spotster from Reed Middle School in Duncanville. And thank you, CJ Hill from Richard Alley Middle School in Crowley. All right, y'all, hit enter and let's have this be our thunderous applause. Thank you all so much. Excellent reflections.